So hey guys, welcome to our first webinar event. We're really glad you guys are able to come. This is our very first one, so just take this as a very casual event. This event is entirely focused on benefiting you guys and just giving our perspective as recent applicants and recent graduates to just give our ideas and our feedback and advice and just anything. We did mention that our general focus will be about essay writing as this is the time where we begin drafting, brainstorming our personal statements or supplemental essays, and that's generally what we're going to be focusing on first, but we were more than welcome to answer any other questions about the application process in general. So we can always branch out to different topics. Just to give a overview, we're going to have a few sample questions in the beginning discussing our experiences on writing the personal statement, our essay experiences, and a bit about our extracurriculars, because that's what you guys mentioned in our stories when we posted them on Instagram earlier. And then from there on, we're going to give you guys majority of the time to just put questions in the Q&A section for us to answer. When you use the Q&A function, you're able to just type in any question. You can type it in anonymously, and then we'll answer them live as we go. So yeah, don't feel shy, and we're gonna get started. Just as a few ground rules, we want to make sure that everyone's respectful. A lot of us are going to be sharing very personal details of our life, especially with the personal statement. So just respect our privacy and respect that we're being vulnerable and able to share our stories essentially. There are no questions that are bad, so feel free to type in any questions that come up, and you're always able to make them anonymous if you feel that way. However, we're also going to be avoiding like stats, like SAT, ACT, and GPA, just because this year it's especially not really as relevant, and we don't find them as, it really depends on a case-by-case basis and doesn't really help anyone knowing our stats. And then just feel free to ask questions throughout. You guys can always type in the chat or in the Q&A section as we speak. So yeah. Now we're just going to give an introduction on all of the 5 panelists we have today. I'll go first. So my name is Stephen Lee. I'm the person who runs Student Uprise. So if you ever DM that Instagram account, that's me. I will be a rising freshman at Stanford University, and I'll be majoring in management, science, and engineering. And then we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves also. So Sebastian.
So hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm from Miami, Florida, and I'm going to be attending Yale University, majoring in environmental studies and maybe political science. We'll see. Santi, that's you.
Yeah, wait, it was lagging. Hey you guys, my name is Santiago Albiat. I'm from the outskirts of East Los Angeles, California, so in a small city called Del Monte. I plan to go to Stanford University, majoring in engineering physics, specializing in either quantum science or energy alternatives. So that's pretty cool.
Hey guys, I'm Narvella Seifa. I'm from a suburb of Chicago, and next fall I will be at the University of Chicago, and I will be studying global studies on the pre-medical track.
Hi guys, I'm Diana Salas. I'm from Chicago, and I'll be attending the University of Pennsylvania next fall, majoring in international relations, possibly economics as well.
I also forgot to add, I'm also from Chicago. I know like a lot of you are from Chicago public schools, so that's also cool. And yeah, we're just gonna get right into it. So our first question is just discussing how we decided to write about our personal statement. Does anyone want to go first?
Sure, I can.
Yeah.
So the way I decided was, it was very like unconventional. My junior year, we wrote an essay about like something that like you always carry with you, or like an idea in your head, or like something that you've learned from someone else that you always carry with you. And my teacher, after I wrote mine, she told me after class, she goes, I loved your essay, and like I think that that's something that would be perfect for your college personal statement. And I said, well, then it's decided. And I found the topics on the Common App website, and I just looked for whichever topic most closely aligned to what I had written my statement about, and that's how I chose.
I guess, in my case, sometimes it's a bit like more direct. I had a rough childhood to make it like to sugarcoat it, but basically I knew that my sort of like my experiences as a child of a son of undocumented immigrants and having like exposure to a lot of violence and drug abuse and stuff like that, I knew that I really wanted to talk about that, mainly because it sort of shifted my perspective from having like a normal point of view, I guess, an average point of view of life, into like a more optimistic, um, like perky kind of attitude. So I really focused on that primarily. I focused on one of the memories that I had, and then I knew that the experiences that I had as a child greatly affected like how I am or how I act today, and how much I value a lot of the things that I've like given essentially. So sometimes a good memory, in a sense, like a memory that affected you like in the long run, is a good way to tackle the personal statement, especially if it was life changing to you. So
Yeah, I'll piggyback on Santi. I kind of approached it a similar way. I thought just like, what are some moments in my life that have led me to be who I am today? And I pretty much narrowed it down to like immigrating to the US, coming out to my family, and an instance that I had with a friend, something that she went through. And I ended up writing drafts for all three, and the one that just felt the best for me was the one about my friend. It was pretty much, I'll keep it really short, but my friend went through like an illness, and it was just like me going there through it by her side and how I grew from that experience. And I chose those three, but out of those three, I felt that like that was the best essay that I wrote, so I ended up going with that one.
So I decided that I wanted to talk about my immigration experience after I had an instance with a immigration officer at the airport a few months before application season, and I thought that was like a realization moment for me in how I viewed myself, how I viewed this country and my own country. And I thought that that was a revelation that I wanted to talk about in my personal statement because it was pretty significant. So I decided to talk about that instance, but I talked about it towards the end. Throughout my essay, I talked about my experience as an immigrant, um, and how, it started like with the day I applied for my visa up all the way until this instance that happened to me. And I just went through it in the most tried to condense a lot of stories into a few lines of each paragraph to like outline what was the most important and see what realizations I've made and how my thought process changed throughout the years and why college was like important for me and how it could change my life.
Yeah, adding on to that. So for me, I really took into account that the personal statement was like the only essay that was going to be sent to every single college I applied to. So for me, I took it more as like a foundation because it needed to be something that I needed all of the admission counselors to know about me. And for me, that was deciding between my immigrant background or my extracurriculars and my passions, because I was always divided between two relatively different fields, which is environmental sciences and business. But I ended up focusing on my immigrant background because I really wanted to make sure that the admission officers knew exactly where I grew up from and how I am the person I am today. Just because I feel like the personal statement is a huge impact on like the holistic review of understanding that my background wasn't necessarily like as built up as my relative peers. So I talked about my parents' immigrations from China to the U.S. Talked about my experiences speaking a dialect that was rarely spoken in the U.S. Talked about my experiences not even fitting within my own ethnic community. Talked about my insecurities within middle school and high school and how that eventually grew up to a point where I ended up learning more about my identity, learning more about my culture, learning more about my first generation identity. That ended up causing a lot more growth in leadership and motivation. My personal statement I want to say was very like a storytelling. It was very direct in terms of this is happening throughout my entire life. A lot of people bring up the idea of like don't tell or show don't tell. For me, it was really hard to fit all of my childhood up until high school within that 650 word limit. So a lot for me it was very direct. I integrated like various quotes that were very meaningful throughout my childhood, mostly like experiences of like racism or prejudice. But beyond that, it was a lot of just directness, and I just really wanted to make sure that my admission counselors knew that before reading onto my extracurriculars or my leadership involvements and etc. I thought that was just a really good way to start it off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just as an FYI, you guys can always answer or ask any questions as we discuss. Sorry,
I kind of
Sebastian.
wanted to add to like what you said, Stephen, and what Diana said. Like your topic can be a starting point to talk a lot of things about yourself. So like my starting point was my experience with my friend, but beyond that, I talked about how that influenced other parts of my life, and like I told stories about those parts of my life too. So the story with my friend was just a starting point, and then I went on to tell how that story impacted me in theater, and I told a story about how I went from being afraid of going on stage to, you know, like realizing, you know, if this could happen to my friend, it could happen to me too, and I need to make the best of the time that I have. And so pretty much like, you know, you can apply your topic to a lot of different areas of your life, so don't feel like limited to like, oh, like I chose my topic, I have to stick to this topic. Like there's a lot of connections, you just have to build them.
And also, like, you'll notice, like, for some of us, we have actually have very similar themes in our personal statement. Like, a lot of us talk about, like, immigrant backgrounds and those kind of stories. But even though that's, like, a common theme, it's your aspect and your personal touch on it that makes it actually your story. Because even though, like, we all come from immigrant backgrounds, each immigrant story is not the same. We come from so many different, like, just culturally specific aspects or experiences. We come from different hometowns, different geography, and there's so many things that make our experiences unique. And that's one of the biggest factors I would, or like advice I would give when writing a personal statement. Like if you think your story is very generic because it's about immigration, but at the same time, you have to be able to add detail to it that makes it your immigration story versus any other immigration story. And that's what I thought was able to help me stick out, even though I was told many times that it was a very common theme or common topic that a lot of students talk about, but it was still something that was huge in my life, and I 100% wanted that to be shown in my essays. If anyone wants to add on to that too.
Yeah, and I will say too, even if you choose not to talk about your immigration background in your personal statement because you wanted to talk about a different topic, there's also the additional information section, which is where I mostly delve into my being a first generation American, like being a child of like an immigrant family, things like that. So I think that your personal statement, like Sebastian said, like is really a great starting point. And I think that the things I talked about in my personal statement tied back to my immigration background without having to say that I learned them exactly from an immigration background.
And definitely there's a lot of topics you can write about your personal statement. We just so happen that a lot of us come from like immigrant backgrounds, and that's just a huge part of our life. But it doesn't mean like you have to talk about your childhood or you have to talk about your background. I've seen several different unique essays talking about like how their dad impacted them throughout their life, or a very significant event in their story that they wanted to bring up to the mission officers. For me, a universal advice I would give is just like, this is the only essay that will be read by all colleges. You will have opportunity to discuss like academics or extracurriculars or some things in supplemental essays, but sometimes you may not get that opportunity. So use this opportunity specifically to mention something that you want all the admission officers to know. Anyone else have opinions on that?
Yeah, I wanted to point out there may be, or like for those of you that are thinking of like talking about or like writing about like a specific memory or just basically telling a story, a general rule is to like have 2/3 of your personal statement have a sort of like a description, and like the last third of your personal statement have like an actual analysis and like a general reflection of like what it means to you or like how the story affected your life. There's sort of like a difference when you're like sort of just listing your story, I guess. There really isn't any depth if you just like sort of describe what's happening or what happened to you. What really enhances like a personal statement into like a really good essay is a reflection part on how you had like personal growth or something really introspective like that.
Actually, I know Stephen did say that you all admissions officers would look at your essay, and while they do, maybe this isn't gonna work for most applicants, but I specifically did make my personal statement towards one specific school. I made it so that every school that I would send my application to would get a holistic view of who I was, but I added specific details that would try to target specific school, UPenn, because I was an ED applicant. So it helped me tie that to my supplemental essays. But I think that if you are going for that in the ED or EA round, I feel like you need to make sure that every other college can know that it's your story and it can be applicable to every single college. While you can make specific details targeted towards a specific college, make sure that no confusions happen when admissions officers are reading your essays and maybe thinking that you were trying to specifically target a school. Make sure that if you are doing that, make it low key so that only the school you apply to would know that you're trying to target them.
Cool. So just out of curiosity, how many times did you guys actually edit your personal statement? Like how many drafts did it take till you were finally kind of satisfied with it and actually submitting it?
So I'll take this one. I edited a lot, like a lot. I think I first wrote the first version of it like at the end of summer or maybe like at the beginning of the school year. And I was still editing it up to like the week that early decision admissions were due. And obviously it wasn't like I was editing it every night, but like every week I would kind of like take a look at it and be like, am I still happy with this? And I would make any edits that I wanted to. And honestly, I think at this point I would say that I over edited it. I don't think it was that necessary to edit it that many times. And then I'll also tell you that on top of that, once I got deferred for early decision round, I ended up editing it again for like the 2 weeks after the decisions in December. So you'll be doing a lot of editing. And I think that is another thing to keep in mind. Like if you're not happy with the personal statement you submit for early decision, you can change it for regular decision. I encourage you to change it if you feel like you can still add more to it, or if you think that it's not showing everything that you wanted it to show. But yeah, moral of the story, I edited it a lot, and both from teachers and peers and just like myself. Yeah.
I'll say that I had a first draft that I wrote for my English class, and then I got feedback from my teacher. I wrote a second one that was kind of similar to that, but even though it received positive feedback from my teacher, I was not satisfied with how it portrayed my story. So I decided to take a completely different approach to how I told my story, and then had that third draft, which was edited by a few of my friends, and they told me specifically how I could make the story flow better and how I could integrate different aspects of my life that would be helpful in the essay. And then I made a final draft and then edited small grammar mistakes or any words that I thought were not necessary. But I didn't edit too much. I kind of just made 4 different drafts and had at my final draft, I made small details.
Yeah. For me, I ended up actually editing like a crazy amount. The way I did it, I started relatively early during like the middle of summer because I was applying for flying programs and a lot of them required like essay topics that were really similar to my personal statement. So that's how I first started my drafts. But it took a lot just to really it was really hard to fit my like 17 years of my immigrant background story that was integrated with so many different identities into a 650 word limit. Like it was just so hard putting all those details in and just really encapsulating all of that. So I ended up giving like I had like a decent draft up to the first day of school. And the very first day of school, I gave my draft to like many English teachers. I gave them to my friends. I gave them to like close friends, of course. I gave them to my college access counselors and mentors. So I had a lot of people editing my draft at the same time, and I just wanted to see what they all got, what impression they got out of it. So it definitely took a lot of editing to get where I really liked it. But I do want to note that during editing, you don't want it to get too diluted with other people's voices, because a lot of time when you're writing it, you can actually, you have like small details that you might not notice, but actually reveal like yourself more, like diction use or like the word choice or the sentence structures that you use. Like that actually really helps with the voice. In addition, don't always take every single editor's advice. So I specifically remember it was September or October, and one of my English teachers recommended me to remove the topic of language entirely from my personal statement. And that was one of the the feedback things I like struggled with the most, because I wasn't really sure if I should accept that feedback. Language was such a big part of my culture, beyond just being like a language itself, but it was a dialect that helped really emphasize like my family specific struggles. And to remove that entirely from my personal statement was something that I really struggled with. Like, is it worth it to, should I focus on one thing versus like my entire story? So that was definitely a moment where I realized that I shouldn't always just listen to my editors or my edits, just because they come from different backgrounds that may not fully understand the extent of what something means to you in your story. So yeah.
Like, I guess in my case, even though like I had my first draft around September, the core of the personal statement that I used was coming from essay topic that I wrote for like an engineering program I had sophomore year, and then I re-edited it like junior year for like another engineering program. So like technically, I guess I had 5 drafts in total, but like the official first draft was around like fall I guess October or September of senior year, and then after that, I did the editing myself with like I guess one college access program counselor. So I really like honestly the personal statement that I wrote was sort of like personal, and I didn't really feel comfortable sharing it with my teachers or like friends that were like even close to me, mainly because I knew that I sort of like I was okay with a random stranger coming from like Stanford or MIT to read it, but like having someone that actually knows me and that I have to contact with or like talk to every single day, and like knowing that they know that part of my life, that was kind of intimidating. So I really didn't really want to share that. So I guess basically, um, I mean, now that I look back on it, I realize how it's sort of like in a way I preserved my source. I guess my my tone or like the way I speak. I guess I just really hate writing. I absolutely hate it. So the supplemental essays in the personal statement, that was brutal for me. But like knowing that I guess I got through it. So yeah, that was pretty cool. I guess. But yeah.
Cool. So does anyone have any questions so far? You're welcome to type them in the Q&A section or the chat. If not, we're going to move on to the next question. But I just want to give a minute for any additional questions from you guys. Okay, we're just going to move on. So a lot of us, there's been many, we kind of touched on this already, but a lot of us are worried, or when I was applying at least, I heard a lot of things about avoiding cliches in an essay and how to just figure out how to stand out from a crowd of applicants. So what were your guys' take on that?
For me, I think the biggest piece that I learned, and I actually learned this at the Pomona Fly-In, was the most important part of the personal essay is actually what Santi touched on earlier. It's not the story that you're telling, because the story will give the people background, and which is obviously important because it's pertaining to your life. But the most important thing that they need to read from your personal essay is what you used that situation to grow. Like whatever you went through, no matter like how horrible it was, how good it was, you need to like show the admissions officers that you're resilient, you're willing to learn, you're willing to grow. And that's the most important part. And obviously people grow in different ways. So I think that's the best way to avoid being a cliche is make sure that you're focusing on how you learned and how you personally grew as an individual from the situation.
Yeah, I also wanted to point out that when you go into an essay like thinking that you want to stand out, many times you're going to try to be like a quirky boy or girl or like whatever a quirky person in general. And like many times, like even though sometimes it might work, like those essays where you really just want to stand out and maybe like you're just showing your like quirky idiosyncrasies or something like that, it won't work unless you have like an actual analysis on how that speaks to you as like as a whole of a person. So like I guess for one of my Stanford essays, I was talking about how like I read tarot cards and stuff like that, which is really funny because I thought it was humorous. But I actually got told that, and like after I reread it, I realized that it doesn't really tell anything about me besides the fact that I have like um, a weird, I guess, hobby. So like really try, even though you want to stand out in an essay, try to stay away from like quirky like topics or essays that really don't have to say anything about the type of person that you are.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Santi on that one. I remember also for one of my Stanford essays, for my roommate essay, I actually started it, and I quote, "Hey roommate, like let's get one thing straight, I'm not." And I think like in the moment I thought like this is so funny, like this is so quirky, like I'm getting in for sure. And like that just was not the case, because I think like at the end of the day, if a roommate sent that to you, like what would you gather from that? Like all you learned is that they're not straight, like that they're either bisexual or some sort of queer. But they didn't actually learn anything about who I am, what drives me. And at the end of the day, that is what you want to show in these essays. In regards to cliches, I think I struggled with that a lot whenever I would want to write like an essay about like immigration or like my cultural background. And I think at the end of the day, in my mind, I partly told myself, like, if this school doesn't care about what I have to say about like my cultural background or like my immigration story, it's not the school for me to begin with. And on top of that, I think it's also about making sure that you tell your story in your own way. Like you don't just want to tell like kind of like what Steven said, like you want to add the specifics that make that story unique to you. And you want to analyze like how that story helped you grow and become the person who you are today. So it's not like just an essay about, like I came here from Colombia when I was like 6, but rather I came here from Colombia when I was 6, and this is how it's impacted me and how I've come to the point where I am now. And then last thing I would also say is when you're writing an essay, you also want to avoid like sob stories in a way, because a lot of times you will write about things that are really like sad, and that have impacted you in lots of different ways, including negative ways. And when you're presenting yourself to a college, you obviously want to be vulnerable, but you also don't want to show yourself as like a Debbie Downer that is only seeing like negative side in things. Rather, you want to present yourself as somebody who's trying to get the best out of every situation and like has an outlook on life of growth and progress, if that makes sense.
I'm gonna add on also to Santi when he mentioned about being quirky. For me, I've heard that phrase many times, like you want to be quirky in your essays because that's who you are. And it's like, for me, I couldn't be quirky in my essays. I really couldn't. It just wasn't who I was. I had to like, I aim for more like the genuine aspect. So like for me, the most quirky thing I probably wrote in any essay was the Stanford roommate one also, but it was about like my cooking skills. But that was like as far as quirky it went. For me, I just really wanted to lay down more of a genuine scene, which I think really paid off specifically for Stanford. So Stanford, when you get a minute, they actually do like this really cute thing where they send you a letter with handwritten notes from the admission counselor. And for me, my admission counselor, I also had an interview with her because I was in Chicago Scholars on-site program. And the thing that she wrote down, she wrote like a really nice note. She wrote down how she was able to really see the genuine like motivation I had that came from my background. Because the way I described my story, my background within the interview was the exact same voice and just like the exact same tone I used within my essay. I didn't try to do it in a fancy way to show that I was like smarter or whatever. I didn't use like big words. I just used it as I would say it in real life, and I think that really helped parallel my application to who I was in person. One of the things that I think that really helped me stick out just within the application POW and the interview itself. What Chicago Scholar does is that they have one admission counselor come to the program and interview 30 students within that entire day. And I strongly think that having that corresponding like attitude or tone or voice within the applicant and the interview itself really helped me stick out that day, and ended up being memorable enough to the point where she wrote a note about it.
So in my opinion, I wrote a cliche story, which is talking about immigration and my struggles to fit in America and whatnot. But what made my specific essay stand out was using a metaphor, a quite unique metaphor that connected specifically to me, and it wouldn't be applied to anything else. I chose to use the national bird to describe my story with different parts and lyrics of a song that was meaningful to me, talking about this bird. And in that way, I was able to break down my story into a way that probably wouldn't have been able to without this metaphor. And I would also say, as my other peers have already said, be a storyteller, but also analyze how your experiences have shaped who you are, and have how your perspective has changed, or what realization you've made, how you plan to change in the future as well, because growth isn't just like one-time thing. You can show that you've grown so far, or how your perspectives change, but I feel like you should also try to include how you will continue to grow because of this experience that you've had, or because of the topic that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think like one like pretty good advice, like blanket advice, would just be like, think of like movies. If you're trying to avoid being cliche, like think of like movies. Like most movies have cliches in them, right? And they're still really good movies. So what you want to think is like, you know, you want to stand out, and you want to make your essays like interesting for this admissions officer that is literally reading hundreds of essays. Like you want your essay to be that one that they remember. So you can still be cliche. Like I've watched hundreds of movies and I still remember some movies with really cliche plots, but there were things in that story that made them stand out. Even though the story might be considered cliche, there were things in that movie that made it stand out, and you want your essay to be the same way, if it makes sense. I don't know if that's a weird analogy, but that was one way I thought of it.
Yeah, I guess in my case, my personal statement was definitely like a sob story, but I think I honestly don't know what made it different, but I know that it was like it wasn't a typical sob story because it was like it's really depressing, and I sort of like added onto it because like I added small details that actually like messed or like contrasted like specific details and stuff like that about how like I smiled throughout the pain and stuff like that. With for the people that did read it, my friends, they said that it was one of the best ones that they've ever read. But honestly, I think it's because it was like I used like my sympathy and like pity. Like sometimes you could use your pain narrative to your advantage, and that's exactly what I did because I really wanted them to make them feel bad because like there are people that go through this stuff, and like a lot of times we sort of like hide it on purpose, mainly because it's sort of like an embarrassing topic to talk about. But like in that case, like you really shouldn't be forced to talk about your pain narrative if you're really not comfortable. But like in some cases, it really works in your advantage, especially because not a lot of students go through a lot of depressing episodes as like I guess what I did or what I went through and stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, let me like clear that. Like I don't want to like you can definitely write like sad stories, and they can like like you can use them. I just meant more like don't try to turn something that wasn't that sad into something that is a sob story, because that, I feel like that's something that people can see through. But if you genuinely have like a story that is like heartbreaking but still rings really true to who you are, definitely use that, you know? Like, but like for example, for me, like one of my essays was about coming out, and I can't write a coming out sob story because I don't have one. So like I guess like what I'm saying about that is like, don't write a sob story if you don't have it, if that makes sense. Like stick true to yourself, you know?
I also really want to emphasize that when you talk about like these really sensitive things and these hardships in your life, when you're submitting this, don't treat it as in like this hardship is exactly what's getting you in. That's what other people might say about you too. Like, oh, you only got in because of your immigrant background, or you only got in because it's easier for a first generation low income student to get in. It's not about that. It's more of you were getting in because you were able to do this with your background. So you were able to you were able to accomplish these activities, you were able to start this club, you were able to lead a new initiative despite having that setback in your childhood, your setback in your background. It's about like that growth mindset. Yes, you can start off with like a pain narrative, and it's definitely something to embrace at times, but really focus on that growth of what you're able to do with that background. Because in my opinion, like my essays were definitely about that struggle of just self-identity and self-acceptance, but it was the eventual growth and confidence that really sparked within my life, and that was something I wanted to show throughout my application, such as the activities that I founded, for example. I do want to bring highlight to some of the questions that were in the chat. I know Bella sent this question a while ago. I think it's a decent time to answer it now. Bella, just to clarify, by compelling like why essays, are you referring to like the why college essays? Or anyone else knows? Maybe I'm just interpreting wrong, but I'm assuming that's what Bella's referring to.
That's what I interpreted as well, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I can go first about why college essays. They were definitely the most annoying to write about, especially when you're just cramming all your applications within a certain time, and then you have not that much time to just research each college individually. But that is something that I highly recommend you do, especially if you can't tour the campus or visit them. If you went on their flying program, that's an amazing way to discuss about why I college. I remember for one of them, I just got back from a flying from Swarthmore College, and I wrote the why Swarthmore College immediately right when I got back. And it was just one of the easiest why essays I was able to write because of that. But beyond that, just be, I mean, very generically, but like just be specific. Really research specific things that you will want to participate in within that college. So, for example, I was really interested in study abroad, so I mentioned very specific programs within the college about their specific destinations and their field of study. I mentioned that a lot. I mentioned a lot of very specific club organizations within that school, especially culture or business related ones. I just really dived into very specific details and aspects of a college that you cannot replace the name for that essay to be used somewhere else. But you probably heard that before, but that's generally just really what worked for me.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing goes for honestly like every college you apply to, because you don't want the college admissions officers to think that you use the exact same essay for every single school. Although you can use the same exact essay for every single school, but just like switch it up to apply to that school, you need to have specific details for each school. So like you might be majoring in something different at a different school, or you might, one thing that I really looked into was different clubs and like RSOs that I could join when I was on campus. And I think that also in my personal statement and my additional info, I just really showed how interested I was in volunteering, community outreach, things like. So I made sure that I looked for organizations that were on campus where I could continue to do those things. And I think that when you put specific names of groups for a specific campus, it really shows the admissions officer that you did your research, you know exactly what's going on that campus, and that's the place that you want to be. And also specifically for the University of Chicago, since it kind of has like the notorious name of being like quirky, although I personally wrote my essays like I did for every other school, so I didn't necessarily make it so quirky. I've seen people who've written theirs in the perspective of like a phoenix or like a gargoyle or something like that, like going through campus, things like that. Like that's one way that you want to stand out. It just depends on the school, because some things that apply to one school, like very like Hogwarts theme-ish stuff, applies to Chicago, but it may not apply to some other school you're applying to. So you just need to be like cognizant of those things.
A good measure to see if your why this school essay is like a good essay is if you can't replace the college name with another name and it still makes sense. So if you have like a general essay and you could replace the name with like any other college and it would still make sense, then it isn't a good like a YX essay. I think the only one I struggled with was like for MIT's Y, because it was like 50 like words and I really had no idea. Because I mean, I loved everything about MIT, but the thing was, I didn't have like, I like whatever I wrote down, I thought it was like a really generalized, I guess, viewpoint that everyone saw, until I remember that like a couple years ago, like I met an MIT engineer, professor, MIT professor who's like, who does postdocs with other people, and I like I used that personal link to talk about how I eventually want to do environmental engineering, and how there's like how she conducts like an undergrad project specifically for environmental engineering undergrads. So that was a really cool thing. And like eventually like I emailed her and I told her that I kind of mentioned her in my like application and if she could sort of like fluff them up or anything. I don't know if she did, but like I like definitely brought it up. But yeah, so if you have any personal links to the college or like anything personal that like makes you stand out from like what other students may perceive the college as, then definitely use that to your own advantage.
I would like to say that you should look for a niche in this college. Really ask yourself like what your interests are and see what lines up, search up something school of what of that you're applying to and see what specific interest. It could be this a really small club that you really like, or it could be a specific program that is very specific to this school and how you would love to be part of this program, or a community that you might find in this school. You should keep in mind that you should be a fit for the school just as much as the school should be a fit for you. The school is trying to gather as many diverse amount of people as they can, but they still always want to keep in mind that the person that they're accepting is going to fit within their community and with the values that they hold. So you have to make sure that you don't only show why you would love to go to that school, but why that school should accept you because you have unique perspective or because you would add this to their program or add this to their community. I specifically used the niche example, and I looked for a specific niche in UPenn that I was really interested in that not most people applying don't know about. And then I talked about how I would use that niche to help me grow, and then how I would use that knowledge I would gain under that program to help the Penn community and other communities that matter to me. So definitely keep in mind that, you know, admissions process is a two-way street. It isn't just you wanting them, but the school should really want you to add something to their school.
Yeah, I was gonna add like kind of just like my short little take on it. I really agree with what Diana was saying. You know, you want to also cater to the school and make sure that they're gonna think that you're a good fit within what they want. So kind of like how Narvella was saying, like, oh, if you're applying to Chicago, like you can get really quirky because like that's what they like. There are other schools that will be known for other things. So like, for example, Yale is like really big on like community, like residential colleges. So one thing that I'm sure admissions officers love to read is how excited you are to be a part of that community, because they want to make sure to get students that want to be a part of that community, that are excited to be a part of that community, and they're excited to contribute to that community, if that makes sense. So yeah, you definitely want to not only show why you want to go to their school, but also why you'd be an asset to their school.
And I think that really ties back to one of the questions that was asked, is there a standard structure for how to write the Why Us essay? And from what I've seen when I was applying to different colleges, a lot of them would ask like, what do you want to bring to our campus, and like, what can we give back to you? So I think that those are the two things, like Diana mentioned, there's a very interesting dynamic to it, not only what can you get out of the college, because obviously you're putting your money towards the college, like you want to get something out of that, but for them to accept you, they need to know that you're going to be committing something to them too. It's kind of like a two-way street kind of thing. You need to have a good balance in your essay as to not only what can you get out of them, but something unique about yourself that you can bring to them. So that also is a good way to like kind of plug yourself in a way, just like, oh, I've been interested in this, I've done things like this, so I think I could bring that aspect of my life to the community as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of structure though, you really can like, you really can approach it from like any, like you can tackle it from any like way, or like any direction. Like I know like some of my essays were like kind of like, I remember my Duke one, I wrote about how like my last name sounded like Duke, and that was initially why I wanted to go to the school, and then that's how I like built up to like my actual reasoning for wanting to go to Duke. And then for other schools it was just really straight up like, this and this is why I want to go to your school. I think you can kind of play around with that, and it'll vary by school, since Santi mentioned like some schools will literally only give you like 50 words, and you'll literally be like, I want have fun with it and tell a story.
I'm also going to add on to the point of really bringing in what you've been part of and how that's going to translate into what you're going to do when you arrive at campus. I can definitely during one of my interviews with an admission counselor from the University of Southern California, they asked me exactly like why USC directly as an interview question, which I was not ready for. But I definitely talked about like initiatives I was part of in high school and how that would translate at campus, and we ended up talking about that one question for like 20 minutes. We were just discussing back and forth like what we could do to USC to improve the environmental friendliness and eco-friendliness it had, the sustainability. We just kept going back and forth about that, and it ended up being a really cool conversation, and just really focused on exactly why I was a good fit, because I could talk about the different ability to double major at USC or the research opportunities at USC, but in addition to being able to contribute to that school. So yeah. I think that round sums it up. We're gonna go on to the next question about how our heartfelt late night talk similar / different to how in depth you should go to show who you are. So just to understand the question more, are we referring to like the late night talks we usually have with friends that are very deep? Are you discussing how deep we should go in terms of that? Right, I'm assuming that's where we're going with. So we're just gonna continue with that. If anyone wants to, Sebastian, if you want to answer that.
I would just say, think of, you have to kind of keep in mind that this is like a first impression. Like, so you definitely do want to go deep. You want it to be deep enough so that they really get to know you, but you don't want to embarrass yourself. Like, you don't want to say anything that's possibly damaging or that wouldn't get you into the school, if that makes sense. Because I think heartfelt late night talks can get embarrassing, frankly. So you want to stay away from any embarrassing aspects. But I really do think you should go like deep. Like, you know, those are the essays that really make it far, the ones that really address you and your personality and what drives you. I think just keep away anything that would be like embarrassing / potentially harmful.
Going on with that, I literally just had like a nice like late night conversation with my friend a week ago, and throughout the conversation, it was essentially a recap of my personal statement. I definitely did try to go as deep as I could in terms of just who I was, just because those were things that were really not, I never really talk about them publicly, obviously, but they're just so integral and part of my life, and that I can always talk about it when needed. And it just really has impacted me throughout my life. For me, it's definitely gone into a lot of insecurities. I've already mentioned about like being able to set my identity, especially for me, like being a Chinese American, but at the same time, coming from a very unconventional background of like only speaking a dialect of Mandarin, while the rest of Chicago's Chinatown speaks like Cantonese or Mandarin. I definitely had a lot of insecurity of fitting in within like my own Chinese community and fitting in within high school later on. So I definitely talked about just a lot of very personal things that really caused me to struggle with my own confidence, with my own just mental health even. So I definitely, in my opinion, I went into that kind of extent of how deep I was. I was just showing exactly, just like plain as it is. That's just what was my life, and that's how I showed it.
Oh, I think another thing I would say is, I know it's not like don't embarrass yourself, but also don't be afraid to put things, which like okay, like I knew people like several other queer applicants, and they would be like, oh, like what if like my admissions officer has like some sort of like you know, what if they're like homophobic or like something like that. I don't think you should ever be afraid of that. I think you can like fearlessly put really any aspect of your personality.
Also, I think there's a difference between embarrassing and vulnerable. It's okay to be vulnerable, but don't stray away from embarrassing.
Ooh, does anyone else have any other questions? We definitely want this to be geared toward your time. This is for your benefit. We're here to just give our take on certain things about the application. So definitely this is the time to just ask some questions. And if you're not comfortable asking publicly, you're always welcome to use the anonymous feature in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen too. So we'll leave this for any other additional questions. If not, so mostly conclude our session today. Okay, someone just asked, how do you feel sure an essay is complete after writing it? Good question. Does anyone want to take that first?
You know an essay is complete when after you read it, you can smile at the end and be like, wow, this is it. You know what I mean? And it really is, I feel like that simple. I remember when I made my last edit, I just, smiled and I said, okay, I am happy with this in, and I will, you know, face whatever consequences come out or don't come out of my essays. So definitely just look for your own satisfaction and make sure that you've gone through all grammatical errors, that your structure is good, and that you're happy with the way you told your story. I would just say if you're happy with it, then it's a good time to stop.
Yeah, I'm gonna just agree with that. There was several essays because I had to submit them really early because of the college access program I was in. I had to submit like 5 applications September 30th, so it was really fast. And when I was reading through my supplemental essays, I was definitely not happy with them. That's how I could tell that I was not complete with them. When I was reading, I just knew like that was not my best work. That was not the best I could have done. But because of the rush, I had that about to submit it. But luckily, someone dragged me and told me like we should work on it more, and actually helped me get through it to the point where I was actually confident in submitting it versus how I felt earlier, where I just knew it wasn't where it could be. So that's how I definitely could tell when I was complete with an essay.
Yeah, I guess this is like there's 2 types of essays that you're gonna write really, and there's gonna be the one that you write like months or weeks ahead, and there's gonna be the one that you write the night of. So the one that you write the night of, you're gonna know it's done when it hits 3 minutes before 12 midnight, and you're like, okay, I have to submit this. I think the other one, I would just agree with Diana. Think of it more of like once you're satisfied with it yourself, like once you look at it and you're like, no matter the outcome of like whether I get in or whether I get rejected, like I know I'm proud of this essay, like I know like I put in good work, like this represents who I am. I think at that point you're done, And obviously once you put it through Grammarly and there's like no spelling errors, that's also a decent sign.
We're going to move on. The next question is, how did you use the additional info section? So that's a great question. It's definitely a really important section. A lot of people use it differently. There's also a lot of different recommendations on how we used it. So I think it's best if we just all go down the line and discuss how, what exactly we put in ours. So I can go first. The very first thing I wrote in mine was about my dialect. My dialect was not on the common application, and I definitely didn't want to just put Mandarin just to substitute it, because that was not, like, Mandarin doesn't suffice for what it was. So I definitely elaborated on that. I also elaborated on one extracurricular, just because the activity section, you only have a few like 100 characters to describe your extracurricular. This one extracurricular was a lot bulkier and it had a lot more involvement with it. So I definitely explained that more. If you guys are involved in research, I included my research abstracts, like really concise research abstracts for the several years of research I've done. And the very last thing I did was I added my additional awards that I couldn't fit in with the 5 initial ones.
For mine, I just mostly, this is where I talked about my immigration background. Similar to Stephen, I talked about how the fact that none of the Ghanaian languages were even on the Common App at all. They're generally not on anything. So I just prefaced that. I also really talked about how growing up, not only as a Ghanaian American, but I also live in a predominantly non-Black space. So I just really talked about that too, because I thought that was important to me growing up and the challenges I faced. So mostly right there, that's when I talked about my immigration background, things like that, things that I did not include in my personal statement.
I think in my case, or like before I start or explain what I wrote, I just wanted to like point out that your additional information section isn't another essay. So like don't ornate it with like where like how you would do it with like an essay. It all has to be concise and straight to the point. If you like add more details, if anything, it just bothers the admissions officers because you're just like you're creating an extra essay like that they didn't ask for. But like in my case, I put all the information that was sort of like that didn't speak to like my personality in a sense, but more on like why I the time that I took up, I guess, or like the time that I needed for other extracurricular or like other activities. So what I wrote is that I'm the direct caregiver of like my niece and nephew, because all the adults were like working and stuff like that. I also clarified about like how I also clarified about like my identity as like a Native American, because I identify as a Native American, but I also didn't want to appropriate the word Native American, mainly because a lot of Native Americans are sort of like associated with the American Indian or like the U.S. Indians, and I wanted to clarify that I'm indigenous to Southern Mexico, so it really isn't the same in my case. Um, and like, I guess the last thing that I put was that I elaborated on an extracurricular activity, which was like my college classes. Um, I take college classes in front of Caltech, which is just like there were like 3 main classes, I guess, and they were all mathematics. And I talked about how like I I wasn't enrolled in the classes because I wanted the units, more because I wanted to get ahead of like the curve of everyone else. So and I talked about how difficult it was because it was like the highest math classes you could take at that college. So I talked about like the 7 hours of homework that I had to do, and then the 50 hours of lectures that I had to attend and stuff like that. So it was really a lot, and I knew that by just like listing it in the extracurriculars section, it really didn't do it justice because it was way more than that. So yeah, in the MIT additional information section, I kind of elaborated on some extracurricular activities that like I didn't get to put because they only wanted 5 instead of 10. So I just talked about, even though like cross country and track and field weren't part of like my big identity or like my overall theme, it did take up like the majority of my school day. And I was involved in it for all 4 years. So I really didn't want to go by and say like, hey, you know what, like I didn't do that, because I did do it. And like it really, I felt like by like including it, it added more depth to like how I use my time outside of school. and stuff like that.
Yeah, I literally had to go look for my additional information section because I didn't really remember what I put on. But I started off kind of just talking about, kind of like Steven, I put a little summary of the research that I did. You do have the option, just like as an FYI, to submit like research supplementals for some schools. But in a lot of cases, that's like, at least I read up on it, and like a lot of people were like not recommending it unless you felt like very, very confident on your work. Because what a lot of schools do is that they'll send it to, like, let's say you do chemistry research, they'll send the chemistry supplement that you send in, they'll send it to a chemistry professor at the university, and the chemistry professor will give the admissions officer feedback on what they thought about, like, on your paper. So I guess like my take on like supplemental research, like submitting a research supplement, would be, don't submit it unless you're like very confident on your work. If it was more of like you collaborated with like a group of people and it was like, you know, like not super advanced research, I would honestly just put it in my additional information section. And that's what I did. I talked about it in my additional information section. I also talked about like any projects that I was like just now starting and I didn't think I had contributed enough time to consider them like extracurriculars, but things that would eventually probably become extracurriculars. So I talked about an environmental blog that I was starting up with my friend from scratch. And I gave them the link to the blog so that they could read any articles I posted on there. I also listed the other honors that I wasn't able to list. And then I also talked about how I don't have like a formal job, but I do some like self-employed like things here and there to help out my family, and how that does take up some of my time. And yeah.
So just to make sure that people know, you don't have to use the additional information section, but I used it very sparingly. I wrote a single sentence because I was not happy with an AP score that I got because I was sick that day, so I was just shook. I was like, this AP score is just not it, especially because it related to the major that I was applying to. I was like, no, this is unacceptable. So I wrote something along the lines of, I was sick the day of the AP exam, so I was not fully able to demonstrate my capacity and knowledge in this subject, and that was it. And then I left it off because there was nothing else I had to say, and it was like, I was just like, please don't deny me, like, don't think that I don't know what I'm talking about just because of one AP exam. But if you don't want to use it, don't use it. If you want to use it sparingly, go ahead. That sentence probably did nothing to my admissions, but you know, I just put it there just because I was nervous. But you don't have to write anything.
Great. Thanks, Diana. I didn't realize that. That's so good. Okay. And we're going to wrap it up. Our very last question is, what if your emotional story does not connect with your interests? I'm just going to start that right away because mine did not match my interest. My personal, more emotional story was just more about like a background of where I grew up from. I wanted to give them a sense of like the home environment I had, I guess the connections I had pre-installed, the different responsibilities I had, but they were in no way related to my interests. My main interests were about like environmental sciences and business, which had no correlation to my background, honestly. But if there was any connection, it would be like my background helped me grow leadership confidence. That was the thing that made it a connection, but it doesn't like, it's not like a direct connection, you know? So yeah.
Yeah, I guess in my case, I like knowing my background, it would have made more sense if I like went into like child services or something like that. But it really was, I really didn't do that. I'm more of a STEM person, like a completely STEM person. I hate English, but yeah, your emotional story definitely doesn't have to do anything with your interests. If you could find a specific detail that sort of like makes your overall theme and student profile cohesive in a way that like it kind of like it gradually like shows you how your emotional story like a small detail that sort of links your emotional story to your interest. That's like a cherry on top, but it isn't necessary. So like what I guess my cherry on top was the fact that like while everything was while everything was going on in my life, I sort of used mathematics and not English as a sort of like escape of reality, mainly because I couldn't read English that very well because it wasn't my first language. But like math and like physics and all that STEM stuff, it's a universal language because you really don't need to know any other like, I guess, any other dialect or language or international language in order to understand the math that's being shown. So I guess that was like the small detail that I included and how why or like on why I decided to pursue like any type of STEM major or career.
I think I have like kind of like two answers to this. I think one, writing college essays and such will really help you. I think for me it was like a growth process as well. Like I think writing essays helped me learn a lot about myself, and it helped me see a lot of connections between my interest and between my backgrounds and my identities and my interests that I had never seen before. So I would say like don't close yourself off to that yet. Maybe there is a connection and you just haven't been able to see it, but maybe you will see it. And my other answer would be that if there is no connection, that's completely fine, because the great thing is that they have interest essays. Like they have literally essays where they ask you like, oh, what are some like things that interest you, or like why do you want to pursue like this major. So definitely don't worry if your emotional story, like your personal statement, doesn't connect to your interest, because you'll have an opportunity to display those interests later on.
Cool. So I think that wraps up all of the questions in the chat. I'm just going to leave it off with one last thing. So we actually have a video that's been made in the last week or so. We have various different speakers that talk about their experience being first generation low income in the college application process. It's a lengthy video, but there's a lot of questions that are answered throughout it. So you guys can just pull up Snapchat and just scan it using the QR code if you want the link to that YouTube. It's also in Instagram and linked in the bio. And yeah, we talk about like financial aid, our general advice, scholarships, those kind of things. And that's just an additional resource. But that essentially wraps up our very first webinar. Thank you guys so much for coming. I really hope you guys found this really useful and a good resource for your future application endeavors. And I definitely want to thank all of our panelists for joining today. Really show how grateful you are for just dedicating your time for helping these juniors out, and hopefully we can be the best resource and we're actually useful throughout this webinar. So yeah.
I'd also want to say, don't be afraid to like reach out to any of us. I think our Instagrams were up on the slide earlier, but if any of you guys ever have like any questions that are more like geared specifically to one of us, don't feel afraid to reach out. We're all super friendly.
Yeah. And if you guys don't have access to like the Instagram accounts or need access to like the video, all of it will be on the student.uprise Instagram account. You can definitely just DM me, and I'll reach out to the correct resources. And then there's always links in the bio, which you'll find. Like the video, we'll have this recorded and uploaded to YouTube within the next few days. And we will hopefully host additional webinars in the future with a variety of panelists. So yeah, thank you guys for coming.